Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Publick Occurrences Climate Change, the Search for Solutions. My name is Ray Nunez. I'm a graduate of the 2015 College Leadership Rhode Island class, and I currently serve as the Communications and Engagement Specialist over at Leadership Rhode Island. As the youngest person in the office, they asked me to show you how these clickers work, and I said, yes, of course. So, if you do have one of these clickers, if you are one of the lucky 100 participants who has one, please raise them in the air. Some are blue, some are white. All right. I'm going to ask you all to please turn them on with the bottom button that says on. Excellent. All right. I see a lot of blue lights. That's a good sign. So we're going to do some test questions because we are going to be asking you some questions throughout the evening to gauge a sense for the room. So let's get started then. Please. All right. Happy Tax Day, everybody. So the first question is, when did you file your taxes? And on your clicker, you have the option to select A, I was very on top of it, so I did it in February, B, March, C, early April, D, last night, or E, hold my clicker, I'll be right back. I don't have Jeopardy music, but this is where that would play. All right, have you all voted? Yes, you're allowed to vote now. All right, please close the machines. Let's try that out. Who won? Ooh, close tie with March and early April. Good job. All right, next question. What's your favorite renewable form of energy? Please cast your vote. A, solar. B, wind. C, very strong coffee. D, toddlers on a hamster wheel. Or E, toddlers drinking strong coffee. Please cast your vote. All right, team, please close the machine. Let's see who won this one. Excellent, solar. Me too, guys, me too. I could vote as well. All right, next question. How did you get here this evening? A, I drove a fossil fuel vehicle alone. B, I carpooled in a fossil fuel vehicle. C, a hybrid or electric vehicle. D, I took the bus, or E, other. All right, please cast your votes. All right, sir, please close the machine. Drum roll, please. You could launch it now if you'd like. All right. Hey, drove fossil fuel vehicle alone. All right, we all understand how the iClicker voting system works. Say aye. Excellent, I did my job. Oh, do we have one more? We have one more. Bonus question, is climate change real? A, no. B, yes, but it's mostly natural. Or C, yes, and humans are primarily to blame. Please cast your vote. All right, please close the machine. C, yes, and humans are primarily to blame. All right. That's all for tonight, folks. Enjoy the programming, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Ray Nunez. Always a pleasure. Now you got your thumbs ready and you're ready to go. I'm Mike Ritz. I'm the Executive Director of Leadership Rhode Island. And for this evening, I will be both your MC, your moderator, and the facilitator of discussion. So welcome to Climate Change, the Search for Solutions. Also known as the Search for Solutions, Come Hell or High Water. That's my personal title. And I thought it was interesting that term, Come Hell or High Water, actually appeared in the Iowa paper first in 1882. The quote was, "Since that time, the best of my friends had become enemies, and strangers have become friends. The devil had broken loose in many parts of the country, and keeping up with the saying, we've had unrevised hell and high water and a mighty heap of high water." So I bring that up because this Publick Occurrences was designed, this is our 9th year. This is our 19th Publick Occurrences Forum, and this is part of the lively experiment that our partners have put together to see if we can have discourse civilly around discussions of a pretty challenging nature. We've taken on all range of topics, and we've done it under the banner of Publick Occurrences. So for those of you who has been here before to Publick Occurrences, welcome back, and welcome for the first time for all you newbies. If you notice, we spell public a little funny. It has a K on it. That's because it was named after the absolute first paper in the colonies that, with one edition, was banned by the king and deemed too provocative. So that is in the spirit of both this evening and all of these discussions, is to talk about topics that can be challenging, hard to agree on. We have different points of view. Tonight is no different. So I'm really looking forward to it. And really, Leadership Rhode Island has been doing this since 1981, convening people across sectors, across industries, across generations, to really get into the issues that face Rhode Island and try to come up with solutions that are collaborative in nature and get us all to work together to make a better community. So without further ado, I want to introduce the president of Rhode Island College, Frank Sanchez.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mike. Good evening. Welcome to Rhode Island College. We are delighted to be hosting, of course, Publick Occurrences, and tonight's conversation should be a lively one. Climate change, the search for solutions. You know, it's become certainly clear to Rhode Island College that energy efficiency is an essential strategy for addressing climate change. In fact, we've done tremendous work at the college over the last several years. In fact, in 2017, we were recognized by the U.S. Department of Education, one of 9 schools in the country designated as a green ribbon school, in large part because of some of the work we've done over just the last several years. For example, in the last 24 months, 100% of our light bulbs on campus today are now LED. We'll save about $2 million over the next 5 years in energy savings. We also have, as many of you have noticed, done a lot of construction and renovations on campus. Many of our academic buildings, in fact, Gage Hall and our largest academic building, Craig Lee, have been completely renovated and are now silver certified through LEED certification. We now have a campus-wide energy management system, and just recently, solar installations have occurred at Donovan Dining Center and our student union. And so this conversation is particularly important for Rhode Island College, and we're delighted to host once again all of you to be a part of this conversation. I'm going to close with some of the best energy efficiency mottos that I've read over the last couple of months, and then we'll turn it over to the panel. Be polite, turn off the light. Conservation, not deprivation. Conserve to preserve. Do the earth a favor, be a power saver. Do what's right, turn off the light. Don't be fuelish. Energy misuse cannot be excused. Flip it off. It's not in use, turn off the juice. Live green, and save energy, save money, save the planet. Enjoy the evening. It should be a great conversation. Thanks so much.
Who knew the president was such a poet? I didn't know it. So I'm going to introduce, my pleasure to introduce the other partner in this. You've known, if you've come to these before, this has been a 9-year partnership between Leadership Rhode Island College, and the Providence Journal. And with us tonight is the executive editor, Alan Rosenberg.
Thank you, Mike. On behalf of the Providence Journal, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's Publick Occurrences Forum. As our environment writer, Alex Kufner, who's on the panel, has written in his series called Rising Threat, our ocean state is vulnerable to the rise in sea levels that has begun and is expected to continue and intensify. He has already chronicled the potential effects on the hurricane barrier in Providence and the drinking water plant in Newport, and there is more to come as the year goes on. But our journalism is about more than pointing out the problems. So I'd like to thank Mike Ritz and Dr. Sanchez for taking part with us, with Leadership Rhode Island and Rhode Island College, in this exploration of solutions to the problems climate change brings about. And all of you, please take part in the conversation too. Tweet with the hashtag #RIClimate, and your tweet may end up on the board over there. That's the hashtag again, #RIClimate. Finally, a special thanks to our panelists and to you for coming here on what started out as a pretty blustery day, or if you're watching via the live stream at providencejournal.com. It's for you that we do the work of exploring the state's most important issues and seeking the answers to Rhode Island's most pressing problems.
Thank you, Ellen. So here's how the evening will work for those of you who haven't been here before. We'll have some iClicker questions. I'll give you some more here shortly. I have some prepared questions for the panelists that they're not privy to as a starting point. And then I'll be right down in there, right there with you, asking questions that you ask and holding the microphone for you. I would just encourage everyone that be pleasant, be respectful, be courteous. I will not release the microphone to you. Trust me, I will not. I will hold that for you, just to ensure that you're all those things. And then near the end, we'll have a final questions with the iClicker. So if you've got an iClicker, don't leave early. We need you, and we need your answers, okay? So you have a program booklet, and you do have everyone's bio, save one person, because we had a panelist come in late for us, and we're happy to have her, and I'll read her bio here a little bit shortly. But let me introduce everyone on the panel, and you'll have to raise your hand because I'm not necessarily doing this in order, okay? So first we have Janet Quoits, Director of Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management. Barnaby Evans, the founder of WaterFire. Anybody ever heard of that thing? WaterFire, yeah, a little bit. Grover Fugate, who's the Executive Director of Coastal Resources Management Council, longest title on here, I think. Alex Kufner, Providence Journal environment writer. You've been seeing his stuff, which is the reason we're meeting tonight. In particular, that really incredible piece, I think, yesterday. Nicole Hernandez Hammer, she is the Climate Change and Environmental Justice Consultant. Monica Huertas, the founding member of Providence's Racial and Environmental Justice Committee. Sunshine Meneses, the Executive Director of the URI Metcalfe Institute for Marine and Environmental Reporting. And Mark Van Noppen, President of Armoury Management. So I'm going to begin the evening with Alex, because he's been on the beat talking about the environment, talking about climate change for about 10 years at the Providence Journal, and covering a range of topics. And so I'd like for you to give our audience your top learning globally, and then how that drills down into Rhode Island and how that fits into Rhode Island. What are our climate change concerns? And particularly tonight we're talking about sea level rise, flooding, and drought. Alex? No, right okay. For your seats.
1 second. Did you want? So Mike had asked me to frame the issue a little bit, so I prepared something here, and I'll just, I can go over this now. So we're here tonight to talk about the impacts of climate change on Rhode Island and what we as a state can do about them. But I'd just like to present the topic in broader terms first. Clearly, these are not problems unique to our small state. The causes are global. Simply put, when we burn fossil fuels, carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere where it builds up over time and traps heat. As the concentration of this greenhouse gas has steadily risen from a pre-industrial level of 280 parts per million to about 410 parts per million today, higher than at any time in millions of years, so have temperatures across the world. In Rhode Island, the average air temperature has increased 3 degrees since 1900, and the annual number of hot days, those above 90 degrees, has been above the long-term average since the mid-1990s. Average water temperatures have risen between 2.6 and 2.9 degrees in Narragansett Bay since 1960. Winter temperatures in the bay have risen as much as half a degree higher. And because the higher temperatures around the world are causing polar ice to melt and waters to expand, sea levels are going up. In Newport, they've risen nearly 10 inches since 1930, and the rate is picking up. We're also seeing changes in rainfall because a warmer atmosphere is able to hold more water. Annual precipitation in Rhode Island has been rising since the 1970s, while the frequency of extreme precipitation events has increased by more than 50% since the mid-1990s. It's difficult to attribute the cause of any single weather event to climate change, but there have been recent storms that scientists say are emblematic of the larger changes in weather patterns. The historic floods in the spring of 2010, which were caused by a succession of heavy rainstorms, are an example of how precipitation patterns are shifting. Superstorm Sandy in the fall of 2012 was unusual in its size and slow movement, causing destruction along the northeast coast, even though it wasn't a hurricane when it made landfall. Recent hurricanes in Texas and the Carolinas were also sluggish systems that were so damaging because they stalled in place. And even the string of nor'easters that hammered New England a year ago may also be a sign of things to come, as storms may be more apt to form in clusters. So you may say that those types of storms are isolated events. What about lasting changes? Is Rhode Island seeing impacts that may be permanent? And the answer is yes. Perhaps the most obvious changes to our fisheries. We're seeing numbers of cold water animals like winter flounder and lobster, species that were once the bedrock of the fishing industry, plummet while black sea bass and other warm water fish are thriving. If you look at a map of the black sea bass population over time, you'll see it slowly move north from the mid-Atlantic as water temperatures rise. We're also losing ecologically vital salt marshes as sea levels creep up. Marshes represent some of the state's richest habitat, serving as nurseries for fish and feeding grounds for birds. But as waters rise, Rhode Island's marshes are flooding and falling apart. The salt marsh sparrow, a tiny bird that nests in the grasses in the upper marsh, may be the poster child for marsh loss. The species is well on the road to extinction because as waters move inland, its nesting window is narrowing and its hatchlings are drowning. Climate change may also be playing a role in the current die-off of oak trees in the southern and western corners of the state. Drought and summer heat weakened these trees, making them more susceptible to the damage wrought by insect infestations. Our forests are experiencing other changes too. Milder winters have been tied to an increase in tick numbers, and they have also allowed the southern pine beetle, a tree pest associated with the southeast, to make its way into New England. It was found in Rhode Island for the first time in 2015. I've written about many of these changes for the Providence Journal, and Alan mentioned the current series on coastal issues, which will be continuing over the coming months. The series is focusing on the coast not because it's the only part of the state that's being affected by climate change, but because I think it's where some of the earliest and deepest impacts are being felt. With 400 miles of shoreline, Rhode Island is exceptionally vulnerable to rising seas and storm surges. We're already experiencing the impacts of sea level rise during moon tides. You go to Waterplace Park in Providence, and you may see ankle-deep water flooding the sidewalks under Memorial Boulevard. But it's not just there. You can see something similar in Wickford Village, the Point neighborhood in Newport, Watch Hill and Westerly, or parts of Warwick, Barrington, or Warren. Climate change is also an environmental justice issue. Some of the worst impacts may be felt in urban areas and low-income communities, places that already suffer high pollution levels and where air quality is expected to deteriorate as temperatures continue to increase. Some of our panelists here tonight will be able to speak about those issues. Others will be able to tell us about programs that aim to protect Rhode Island from flooding and storm damage, as well as state efforts to reduce emissions. I'm sure that as we discuss state policy, federal policy, including the Green New Deal, will also come up. We have representatives of the business community here too, to give their perspective. We also have an expert in communicating climate change and how to translate science so that you and I can better understand what's going on. And with that, I think it's time we got started.
Thank you, Alex. So bust out your eye clickers. We've got next set of questions for you. How optimistic are you that we can adequately address the impacts of climate change? A, highly optimistic. B, somewhat optimistic. C, somewhat pessimistic. or D, highly pessimistic? All right. Let's see where we're at. Somewhat optimistic, but what really takes it is somewhat pessimistic. How significant is the threat posed by climate change? A, the most significant threat we face. B, one of several significant threats. C, moderately significant. D, not very significant. And E, not a threat. One more of you. There's one missing vote. You can't decide. Oh, there you go. One of several and the most significant. In daily life, how often do you take steps to reduce your carbon footprint? All the time, A, B, frequently, C, occasionally, D, seldom, or E, never? All right, we're there. Frequently to occasionally. Which of these would be most effective in combating climate change? A, switching to renewable energy. B, establish a carbon tax. C, drive less, use public transportation. D, improve energy efficiency. Or E, develop technology to reverse the problem. Pick the best of all of them. This is Paul Parker's data, folks. There are 100 eye clickers in the audience, ma'am. Yeah. Handed out randomly, or as random as we could get you coming through the door. There we go. We got all 100. Switching to renewable energies is by far the top choice. All right, we'll come back for that final eye clicker question in a minute. You heard Alex talking about the coastline, and fortunately for us, we have Grover, the Executive Director of the Rhode Island Coastal Resources Management Council, with us this evening. And I'm going to kick it off with you, Grover. You've been in your role for 33 years, focusing on the coast. And is there a greater sense of urgency today than what you experienced years ago? And if so, why? And what new solutions have you found to implement?
I think the answer to that is definitely yes. There are several reasons for that. The first is that when I first started my career, climate change rarely was talked about. It was, I think, within the scientific community they were aware, but not something that had entered our daily lives. The thing that was also driving, I think, the whole sense of climate change right now is the changes that we're seeing. They're occurring at a time scale that we shouldn't be seeing these. When we look at, for instance, the changes that are happening to the ice sheet, they're at a scale right now and a timing that is unprecedented. So we are, I think, more aware of that at this point. There are also changes that each of us can see. For example, Alex gave the salt marshes. The losses that we're seeing in our salt marshes in Rhode Island are alarming. And again, because it's the time scale and the rate that it's occurring at is, again, unprecedented. So we are looking at this and trying to develop a program that will inform public of the risk that they take on when they develop in coastal areas. And we've developed a series of tools that are both for the community but all the way down to the individual property level that allows people to see going forward in time what that risk might be for their property, not only from sea level rise but also from coastal storms. You have to realize that we haven't had a major coastal event here since the '54 hurricane. So it's been a long time, and people really don't understand the magnitude of what those storms can do. So the modeling work that we've been doing gives communities a glance at what that future might look like. And then we also then can throw various sea level rise scenarios along with that, so that it gives a sort of a sense in time what's going to happen with that. So it's being integrated into our permitting program right now. It's being done for public education purposes for applicants so that they can look at the risk. And we've also developed standards that aren't based on today's conditions, but based on future conditions. So it allows them to build to a future condition, not to today's. So hopefully when they get to the end of that 30-year mortgage period, they get a sellable home. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Grover. Janet Quoits, the director of the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management, and has been since 2011, but she's also no newcomer to the topic of climate change. She first crafted national environmental policy as counsel to the U.S. Senate Committee on the Environment and Public Works prior to 1997, when she then came over here to run the Nature Conservancy in Rhode Island for 10 years before heading DEM. So my question, Janet, is we're hearing from Grover about the coast, but there's a lot more going on than this. There's flooding, there's drought, there's a change, and I'm wondering what's the state's biggest challenges, and are we doing enough around sea level rise and flooding currently?
Thank you. Let me just start by saying, as the director of DEM, we oversee fisheries and forests, and we work with agriculture, and we implement the environmental protection laws, and there is no part of DEM that isn't impacted by climate change. And I agree with the people who voted that it is the most significant issue of our time. So when it comes to flooding, Alex talked somewhat about some of the changes in weather, but obviously flooding affects every community. Flooding puts people at risk. It leads to tragedy. It leads to pollution. It leads to destruction. And some of the worst flooding events have been actually along our rivers. And we are getting, today we got almost half an inch of rain. Last year we got more incidents of more than 1 inch of rainfall than we've ever had before. So we have infrastructure that's not prepared for how wet it is. This was the wettest winter ever in the contiguous US. And we have communities that really aren't prepared for flooding, and some communities are disproportionately affected. So I think that the coastal flooding, we have the inexorable rate of sea level rise compounded by storms and flooding, but in our rivers, we've seen in 2010 the wastewater treatment facilities get flooded, for example. So I think the biggest challenge is making all 39 cities and towns prepared and working, informed by science, with engagement from the community to take the smartest actions they can to mitigate risk, and to have the government work with business and the communities to make sure that the decisions that we're making and the money that we're spending is about enhancing natural systems that can collect and buffer stormwater, retrofitting old infrastructure, and taking actions to protect people. So having said that, I want to give one quick example where I think we're doing a good job, but we absolutely need to do more. This is a big, important, urgent issue, and we need to all do more. But one example where I feel relatively good about it is seeing that the wastewater treatment facilities, which are of course in low-lying areas to take advantage of gravity, seeing that they were flooding and that putting untreated sewage into our waterways with bacteria and all the things, the pollutants that can make people sick, that we took on an assessment to look at how vulnerable these systems were, working hand in glove with the communities and the facility operators, and put together a plan, working with an engineering firm to mitigate risk, and then put together some funding through the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank and some bond money, and we're trying to work to mitigate risk. So you already see Warwick with their berm. Warren is right now under construction, building a new wastewater treatment facility that is going to better deal with the inevitability of flooding. So I think that kind of action where we evaluate the vulnerabilities of our infrastructure, work to strengthen and mitigate risk, and in some cases really pursue undevelopment or retreat or just getting people out of harm's way and letting nature own what nature should own.
Thank you, Janet. We heard earlier Alex talking about environmental justice, and Nicole Hernandez-Hammer is fairly new, a newcomer to Rhode Island, but she's a climate change and environmental justice consultant. I just wanted to start because I don't want to assume everyone knows what environmental justice is. Could you just tell the audience what that is?
Sure. I mean, it's really simple. It's just making sure that everyone has equal access to clean water and clean air and is equally protected from the impacts. Oh, is this not on? Oh, okay. Yeah. I was saying it's really quite simple. It means that everyone should have equal access to clean air and clean water, to quality food, to protection from the impacts of climate change, and to be able to participate in a green, renewable economy.
Thank you. You were a special guest of Michelle Obama's at the 2015 State of the Union address because of your activism and your research, which I'm told is cutting edge at the national levels. And so I'm wondering, what cutting edge discoveries have you made that could contribute to solutions in Rhode Island or the New England region?
Well, I think a lot of times when I'm a biologist, and I worked in academia for about 15 years, and most of that time I looked at the impacts of sea level rise on urban and natural systems. And as an academic, generally academics are often far removed from what those impacts look like to folks in communities, especially in low-income communities and communities of color. And so what I did is I took the mapping that we were doing in academia and I used it to work with folks on the ground. I mapped low-lying elevation places that also were low-income, and I went to those places during the highest tides of the year in places like Miami and in the Carolinas. I also did something similar with heat, looking at urban heat island effect and the places that were going to be worst impacted. And I held community events, and I developed resident-led strategies so folks could be able to participate. And I think especially in low-income communities, people's time is stretched pretty thin. And so it's hard to deal with issues that we talk about that are 10, 20, 30 years in the future. And sometimes folks aren't making the connection between the heat they're feeling or the flooding that they're seeing to sea level rise, increased temperatures, and the bigger picture of climate change. And so having those discussions in those moments and making sure that residents' voices were at the forefront of those discussions with local leaders and in local and national media really was able to shift conversations around environmental justice in some of the most vulnerable communities in the country.
Yeah, thank you very much. You know, probably there are fewer people in our local community that understand environmental justice as Monica Cortez, who is the founding member of Providence Racial and Environmental Justice Committee. We added her to the panel late, so I want to read her bio to you so you'll know who we're going to hear from. She's the lead organizer for the No LNG in Providence and serves on the board of directors for Direct Action for Rights and Equality, otherwise known as DARE, which organizes low-income families and communities of color for social, economic, and political justice. She's a resident of Washington Park in Providence, where she lives with her husband and 4 children, so I'm imagining the future is important. You've got 4 kids. What's the state of environmental justice in Rhode Island, and particularly as it pertains to water, sea level rise, and flooding, Monica?
Thank you. Well, I can tell you that it's pretty bad in general. I mean, this whole topic that we talk about is pretty bad and pretty dire, but specifically for us who live in the city, us people of color, it's significantly more dire, and we feel what's happening. We feel the impact. We feel it closer. A lot of us, live, especially like us who live near the Port of Providence. We feel these kinds of, when it rains, Allen Avenue floods. I'm sure some of you have driven down that area. Allen Avenue is just, sometimes you can't even drive down that area. So we definitely feel it. We're feeling it the most, and we feel that if something major was to happen, like we see in some of these hurricanes and these superstorms and things like that, we feel that we would have the greatest impact, but not also, and also be, you know, rescued the last, and taking care of last, like how it happened in, you know, with Hurricane Katrina, or how it happened in Puerto Rico, where, you know, people of color were pushed to the margins. We're already pushed to the margins, and then something like this happens, and then we're even pushed even more. So we're definitely feeling it, and, you know, we are upset and mad about it, and we've been organizing around the coast, especially, like I said, around the Providence Bay, where we have a significant amount of toxic pollutions in that area. Within a 1 square mile, we have like you know, square miles of toxic pollutions, of tanks that have jet fuel oil in them. You know, just the compounded effects of climate change in general, plus all these other compounded things in it. We feel it, we live in it, we breathe it day to day. You know, we smell it. Go down Islands Avenue, we smell it. So yeah, it's there.
Thank you, Monica. Dr. Sunshine Meneses is the Executive Director of URI's Metcalfe Institute for Marine and Environmental Reporting. Now, besides having the absolute best name you could possibly have as an environmentalist at all, Sunshine, give me a break, come on. Is that real? All right, so I love that name. And if you've met her, she's very bright and very sunny, I will admit. But she's taken this experience of oceanography and environmental and energy policy to promote societal participation in science through journalism and effective communication. So, is the message getting out clearly in Rhode Island, let's talk about, and is it getting out enough so that people can understand the immediate and long-term changes?
Okay. No.
What's the problem, Sunshine? What is the problem? Look how quickly she got off the hook.
You wanted concise, I'll give you concise. Okay, so yeah, no, it's not. And I think that there is no one simple answer to explain why the messages about climate change are not getting out clearly, and that's item number one. There are messages about climate change. There's no one thing that we necessarily need to communicate. There are so many different things, and what we need to communicate most entirely depends on who we're trying to talk to at any given time, you know? So if we are, for example, you know, if there's a meeting where Mark and other developers are attending, for example, the ways that you're going to be talking about climate change are very different than if you're meeting with the group that Monica runs, because the needs of each of those audiences are very different. The ways climate change affects them are different. And yeah, obviously there are aspects of this that we all feel in the same way. We're all experiencing flooding. We're all experiencing this litany of issues that Alex just expressed. But it is really important to think very carefully and strategically and respectfully about the ways we are trying to communicate about climate change. And I just don't think that's done nearly often enough.
So you're doing this with students, but outside of the academic world, how does that take shape? And how do you get folks to understand proper messaging in general? Because frankly, our country is riddled with the problem of where the truth is anyway, and folks are struggling with this, right?
Yes. Again, yes. So there are many different ways. So at Metcalfe Institute, the ways that we do this are primarily twofold. So we do science training for professional journalists. I'm super proud to say that Alex Kufner has gone through one of our programs. I like to tout that because he's so good.
It was a great program.
So part of it certainly is helping journalists cover these really complicated stories. Most journalists around the country who are doing environment reporting don't have any kind of science background, and often they start doing environment reporting because they've been assigned a story, period, you know, and that's it. That's what they're asked to do. And then another piece of it then is helping scientists become more effective communicators, because scientists, and I say this as someone who, you know, came up in the science world, in the academic world, we are not taught how to communicate effectively. It's a problem. It's a real problem. This is part of why I'm really excited to be teaching students about communication, because it's part of our obligation. So, I think those are two parts of it, but then the other thing that I loved that Nicole said is that this is about public engagement, so it's not about any one group, whether it's journalists or scientists or regulators or whomever, or community members being the best communicators. It's about all of us who want to actually talk about this, figuring out ways to do it much more effectively, and actually inviting the voices of many people who are affected, not just the people who always have the platform, but especially the people who are not generally given the platform.
Thank you very much. Let's talk to a businessman, if we will. Mark Van Noppen, president of Armoury Management. They have a portfolio of 400 apartments and over 300,000 square feet of mixed-use commercial. And I know, Mark, that a large part of your work has been, and this is since 1982, has been renovating Victorian homes, old properties that I'm guessing climate change wasn't really thought of when these buildings were being built. So what's been your experiencing as it relates to, in particular, sea level rise and flooding as a developer?
Okay, thanks, Mike. Before I answer the question, I just want on messaging, I'm just responding a little bit to what Sunshine's saying. The facts and figures and messages just roll by people, and myself, okay, so the temperature's risen by 2 degrees, 3 degrees. What's the big deal? It's like 90 degrees, it's 92. It's 70, it's 72. Not such a big deal. So there has to be some way of conveying to people the significance of 2 or 3 degree temperature rise. And I don't know if it's like the analogy of the human body, the planet as the human body. I don't know what the analogy is, but there's just this incredible wall that people run up to when you say, well, the sea level has risen 10 inches in 100 years, and they stand down at the ocean and they look at 10 feet of dunes and they're like, okay, I'm not gonna worry about that today. I'm gonna get in my SUV, I'm gonna drive to the convenience store. So there really have to be some sort of, it's just I think it has to be boiled down to the most simple analogies that people can sort of get their heads around. I understand a disaster will wake people up like nothing else, but anyway, I just wanted to get that out before I forgot. So, as a developer doing this work in flood-prone areas, well, buildings, they leak, they fall apart. So vicious storms, radical storms, heavy rain, heavy snow, followed by heavy rain, et cetera, is just a big problem for people that build buildings, maintain buildings, et cetera. So we're increasingly concerned about that. Old buildings are particularly prone to it because you have slate and copper and built-in wooden gutters and things like that. So it tends to be more complicated. In the portfolio along Valley Street, as the whole watershed has been paved, not the whole watershed, but as increasing amounts of the watershed's been paved, the flooding has become, and the suddenness of the river rise has become much more severe. And there certainly has been a greater incidence of flooding in the past, more recently, 2010 was horrendous. So we developed a system of floodgates that are pretty simple, almost like submarine doors we attach over. It very quickly can roll out the carts to the properties, out of the garage to the properties, and just install these floodgates and keep water from entering the building. It sort of, I've said the best thing that could happen to us since 2010, when everyone panicked, is we could have another flood because we think we've prepared for that eventuality. It certainly will happen again.
How often in your world, Mark, in development, do you change projects because you realize, this isn't the right place to do this because inevitably there's going to be flooding or there are going to be all these environmental concerns?
Well, this is one of the effects of climate change, right? I saw, Senator Whitehouse, I got an email about climate change, opened a couple links, looked at the CRMC maps, and saw that parts of Warren were going to become an island, and there were huge inland sections that were flooding and realized a property I'd bought very recently was in that area. So I sold it.
If you're the poor sucker that bought that, I'm sorry.
So I mean, it's disinvestment. What can I say? It was like, you know, and if the new buyer, I don't know if they're looking at the maps and saying, well, I'm not really going to invest in this for the long term. I'm just going to sort of, you know, milk this in the short term. I don't know what they were thinking. Maybe they weren't thinking.
Maybe it's the next yacht club.
Could I just, in terms of
Yes, Janet,
the first point that Mark made, our Department of Health has done research that's cited nationally, if not internationally, on that when we have more days above 90, we have more emergency room visits, we have more deaths. I think one of the, and we have, of course, heat islands in our urban areas. Our wealthier areas tend to have more trees, and people have more air conditioning. So these issues are so significant and real, but I don't disagree with you. I think that people feel helpless about what to do about them. Yeah. And I think that as we have more weather events that seem so extreme, people are actually tying them to climate change, where it used to seem more anomalous. You know, I know we need to do a better job of talking about it, but we see the impacts.
I wish President Trump would turn his sloganeering to climate change to the benefit of the cause instead of to the detriment, because he certainly comes up with some good ones.
Can I ask a question?
Mark's entering his foray into politics this evening. Yes?
It's building on Mark's question, also Sunshine's too, and I'll direct it to Sunshine, but anyone can jump in. I also wonder about messaging too, and I wonder what's more effective, if it's presenting the worst case scenarios, which I often do, but I also wonder if people tune that out because they think they can't do anything about it. And I just wonder, is it more effective to show that, or should we be optimistic? I just wonder what your opinion is.
So it's not effective. So these are called fear appeals in the communication research, but basically showing the very negative, telling a very negative story, especially if you consistently tell a very negative story. In fact, this is not a good way to engage people. People really do shut down. They feel really disempowered and like, why should I bother? But on the other hand, I'm not suggesting that the answer is to be rosy about it, not at all. I think that there's some middle ground. I mean, people need the facts. People need to know what we're up against here. But what has been shown to be much more effective is especially to give people kind of a mix of these things. So, you know, like, here's this very bad situation. Here are some of the things that are being done about it. Here are some of the ways that the state agencies or whomever it is that's in charge of the particular issue are responding, are planning proactively. Here's something you can do at home, if there is in fact something you can do at home, you know? So it's this combination of like, yep, there's some bad stuff happening, but there are ways that we can address this.
Sunshine, you know, back in my timeshare days, yeah, I'll admit it, I sold timeshare. Back in my timeshare days, to get a sale, urgency was critical. To get someone to make a move, to do something differently, to take action, you had to frame urgency. So, you know, how do you frame and message that sense of urgency if it's not going to be a complete crisis and disaster? I'm asking the person that knows. I'm just saying. Yeah.
I don't know that we really have a great answer to that question yet, honestly.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot that we don't know clearly about how to communicate effectively about climate change. Nicole, do you have thoughts on this from your work?
I mean, I think it's important to talk about the sense of urgency, and I think that's why the approach I take is talking to folks. Oh, okay. So sorry.
You can pull that right up to you. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think, how do you not? The reality is we've got about a decade to avoid catastrophic climate change, and it's really hard to sugarcoat that story.
Do you hear that? She said a decade to avoid catastrophic climate change.
And we have to take aggressive action, and we're not doing that. In fact, our emissions have gone up by 3%. Mm-hmm. So it's, you know, I was giving a Climate Change 101 presentation at Dillard University in New Orleans, and it was in 2015 to a group of community members and students that were going to go to Paris and talk about how climate change was affecting communities of color. And so I did a...
Nicole, will you speak
I'm so
closer,
sorry.
please? Yeah, thank you.
I'm so sorry. And so I was doing a Climate 101. And there was a Native American chief in the audience. And after I gave my presentation, which was very much trying to do the positive side of things, and yes, there's bad news, but here's what we can do, which I think is really important, he got up and he said, I can see that you're not telling us the whole story. And I think it drove home the point that there is the concept of the privilege of information. And so in Sunshine, you say that the story that you would tell or the messages that you would use when you're speaking to Mark, is it, would be different than Monica. How different would that be? And does that create inequality in terms of access to information, which we already know exists in communities of color? So I think it's really important to take that into account when we're messaging and be transparent about the reality of what we're facing, because it is grim.
Can I just respond to that really fast?
Yeah, go right.
So yes, I totally agree with you. And what I mean when I say thinking about different audiences and how you're talking with those audiences is I mean, I appreciate that comment, because you're right. I think it's really easy to think like, okay, well, I should be sharing like this type of information here and that type of information there. But it's what I'm trying to get at is that it is about what is most relevant for whomever it is you are talking with. And the thing is that that doesn't preclude giving the whole story. That's not at all what I'm advocating for. It's just that if you want people to actually listen to you and feel like, I need to respond to this information in some way, then that information needs to actually be compelling for whomever it is you're trying to communicate with.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think that it would be important if I'm having that conversation with Mark's group and he's talking about his property in Warren that I guess is now even less valuable than it was when you sold it. Who's going to be left holding the bag? And is that the place where affordable housing is going to be built? And I think that's information that Monica's community needs to know. And I think Monica's community needs to have a sense of what's happening with the developers, because that's the discussion around affordable housing, and that's a key point that needs to be made. So I think there needs to be maybe more exchange of information instead of more division of information.
Can I just jump in here? Because one of the things that we were noticing as we started to develop these tools and we started to see, and one of the problems, I think one of the frustrations we suffer from on our staff is we see, because these tools look into the future, we see what our future looks like, and it's kind of frustrating not to try to convey that to people so that they understand and can make better choices going into the future. But for affordable housing, what we were noticing is there were affordable housing projects coming in for some of these areas that were in the flood-prone areas. And there was no information being given to those people to let them know that. And they are obviously the segment of the population that can least afford to rebound after one of those events. Yeah. So what we stepped in is we stepped in with Rhode Island Housing, and we started to have discussions with them about their funding mechanisms and how they were funding these types of projects. And we have since, I think, pretty much put a stop to that at this point. But yes, there are segments that get taken advantage of. I think one of the biggest concerns we have is not that first row of houses. First row of houses, in many cases in Rhode Island, are second, third, and fourth homes. They can easily take the hit and walk away from it. It's the people that are 2 to 3 rows back that can't afford to take that hit, and that's where we try to focus on.
Yeah, thank you, Grover. I'm going to switch for last question, and then I'm coming out there with you, so you got your good questions ready. I'm going to be right out there with you. Let me introduce to you Barnaby Evans, the Executive Artistic Director and founder of Waterfire. How many people here have been to Waterfire? Show of hands. Wow, when you send a message, Barnaby, people might know what's up. He's also a 1995 graduate of Leadership Rhode Island, I'm proud to say. And so you're wondering, what's this guy with a ponytail and an artist doing up here talking about climate change? And yet he's been studying climate change and speaking out for at least the past 10 years. He's also a scientist, you might not know that. And so, how does this relate to Waterfire, Barnaby? Why are you involved?
Well, first of all, this is, as everyone's been saying here, sort of the existential moment we're all facing. So everyone in this room needs to be involved. So there's that. I'm not quite a scientist, but I did study science in college, and I've been fascinated by that, the holistic perspective that comes from looking at ecology, which is what I actually studied. And in fact, that led to inform my artwork about trying to deal with the many complex interrelations that happen. And the challenge we've all been wrestling here is this is an exceptionally complicated problem that sits right at the nexus of the things we're not particularly good at in our political process. It's, first of all, fiendishly complicated. There's a lot of uncertainty. We're making projection models that are difficult to interpret, so there's a lot of room for political sniping and misrepresentation. It also is a long-rolling emergency crisis, so it's in a time frame which is out of range with political frameworks or even housing development frameworks. So we're asking all of us to make a decision whose greatest impact is going to be, you know, in the Native American tradition of the 7th generation, or even not that long now. But it's a very difficult way. It's hard to motivate action when the payoff is for a future generation, but it's also fundamentally necessary. And I think we need to be doing this communication effort, which is, the science really is, it's not quite settled, but it's more or less settled, and we've got variations on what the modeling will be. Now the challenge is how we solve what is technically called, by epistemologists, a wicked problem. That's actually a technical term, where all the solutions have feedback loops that recur everywhere, just as Mark was talking about. He took the information that the state of Rhode Island makes available to everybody and said, gee, I made a wrong decision. So he then made a personal decision, and we were asking who's going to buy it. And Monica's right is in that, well, and you also mentioned it, is in that with public housing, where people will choose the least expensive land to build something, we had a structure in place that was reinforcing bad behavior. So you really have to think through how all these things ripple through in a deep, deep way. And Waterfire was a project we started 25 years ago when, after the rivers were picked up and moved, which Janet's agency was involved in a brilliant effort to reformulate the future of Providence. But even with that, 25 years ago when we started it, what struck me coming from out of state was how negative people's perception was about the city of Providence and its future. And we were trying to see if art could be added to all these other ways of dialoguing and intersecting with the entire community to change deep felt perceptions through everything from metaphor to myth to arts to rhetoric to actually gathering together, because our larger mission was to try to make the city itself viable and a place where you wanted to live, because that's the most important environmental statement we can do, which is to preserve these historic buildings and the investment of energy and time and resources that are in them, and make dense living where you don't need to travel in a car successful, and to turn cities around. That's city building, and the efficiencies of city is what we all need to focus on. So it was that perspective that brought us to Waterfire. And the last thing I'll say is there's so many people working in this, and it's a great panel, Mike. I don't know, I guess you're down in the field already. It intersects with all these different areas, and I completely agree, optimism is important. Oh, I'm sorry. That optimism is important. It's so difficult to get the balance right between the very real existential threat we're facing, and we've been talking about this since the 70s, so this is not new. And yet it's very hard for us to make the solution, in part because many of the negative ramifications are what economists call externalities. They're not included in the cost-benefit ratio by which we make decisions or politicians make decisions, and that's the challenge. So we've got to have artists, writers, philosophers, lawyers, scientists, researchers, everyone has to be fully invested
Community
in
members.
making this challenge. Yes.
Questions from the audience?
There we go. All righty. I'm coming to you, all right? So I hold the microphone, you ask the question. Yeah? Please, introduce yourself, ma'am.
I'm Roxanne Stern. I live in beautiful Riverside. My question, I think, would be best addressed to Ms. Quoit and Mr. Fugate. I think many of us in this room would agree that there are many climate change deniers among prominent people at the federal level. However, I have been happy to note that many of the states, most prominently our own, they've been taking up the burden, they've been drafting legislation, and they've been supporting private industry projects to try to get our technology changed and try to mitigate the effects of climate change. My question is, how far can just the states themselves go? How much of the work can states do on their own? And how can we all work to create a tipping point so that we can then get the backing of the federal government? Thank you.
Yeah.
Great question.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to start and then hand it over to Grover and whomever else. But I think there's two related things we're talking about, and one is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and another is enhancing the resiliency of our people and our infrastructure and our communities. So I just want to address, because the panel isn't really necessarily about global greenhouse gas emissions, but we're talking about the symptoms of that. And I just want to acknowledge that really the federal government is absent in dismantling the things that we need to do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So it is the states and the states working together that are doing the most important work in that sphere. And I think Governor Raimondo joined with other states on, to try to hit the targets under the Paris Agreement, but without the federal government playing its role in forcing a clean power plan, you're seeing emissions increase. So I think we need the states. We're working right now on a transportation program to try to reduce emissions from the transportation sector, but at the same time, the Trump administration is rolling back the fuel economy standards. So it feels like we're working at cross purposes with the federal government, but I think what the work happening at the state and regional level on reducing emissions is critical. On the resiliency side, this is where we live. We have responsibility to take action here, and I think we're doing some really important work leading that effort, and I'll hand it over to my colleague.
Okay. Yeah, I think on the mitigation side, that is trying to avoid the effects of climate change. Again, you're seeing the states take that initiative. The federal bureaucracies are often very large, very cumbersome, and not really hotbeds of innovation. It is the states and the communities that are really at the forefront of many of these issues and often see these problems much earlier than the federal government does. So I think it is something that we are doing, particularly on the adaptation side, that is trying to adapt to what we're seeing. It is the states and the communities that will lead that effort. Hopefully what the federal government will at some point do is provide some of the resources to help the communities do that, because they are going to be in desperate need of that funding to try to deal with this.
Let me also, I brought a prop I just want to show people, because the governor created a chief resiliency officer and asked us to do a statewide plan. So we do have a plan, Resilient Rhody, that is about what the state could and should do. But of course, we need all of our communities to also be successful, and I think the focus is rightly now shifting to providing resources and engagement with the municipalities and the communities on resiliency, where the rubber really meets the road.
And the state needs to stop building, the state of Rhode Island needs to stop building fossil fuel infrastructures. It's that easy, it's not that complicated. It's not that complicated, and we have to stop going back saying the feds this, the feds that. We need to be about our business in our state and about the people who live in our state, and take responsibility for passing these laws and permitting these infrastructures and fossil fuel industries in our state.
Chief, sir, you don't have a microphone, I do. Chief Resiliency Officer is a pretty awesome title. Where is Sean anyway? Oh, there he is. Stand up so people will know you. It's a great title, I love it. Hank Webster has a question up on Twitter, and I'm going to let him ask it.
This is my most tongue-in-cheek question of the three I've posted, but Barnaby, recognizing the transportation emissions from folks coming to Waterfire, which I am as guilty of as anybody, and also the release of stored carbon from the firewood, and everything else that Waterfire does, what steps is Waterfire taking to make itself carbon neutral?
That's a very good question. We think about that often. Our largest carbon footprint is people traveling to come enjoy Providence, by far, the transportation. And our intention was not to create a tourist event that would bring people into Providence, but to actually make an event that we would be celebrating ourselves. That's exactly the sort of quandary all these things fall into. All the wood we use is wood that we're taking out of the waste stream. It's not wood that we're felling for that purposes, and unfortunately there's a lot of wood that is trees that are taken down. So the carbon goes back into the environment, whether it goes through aerobic composition and landfill or whether it's burned. So we turn off as many of the lights we can downtown and try to show Providence as a new light. But you're absolutely right that we think a lot about that challenge, and that's the conundrum we're in the midst of.
If I could jump in and defend Waterfire just a bit. I mean, Barnaby started his sort of raison d'etre as in bringing back the city as being the strong, the greatest thing that he could imagine doing for the environment. The Preservation Society in the Providence Preservation Society in the early 90s had a bumper sticker, save a forest, recycle a neighborhood. And the idea was, the idea is obvious, but it sort of goes beyond the obvious. If you renovate an apartment house, you don't have to build a new one out in the suburbs. But there's actually an incredible amount of embodied energy in those houses, in those structures, in those streets and curbs and pipes and everything else. So if in fact the spirit of Waterfire is getting people to be, wow, I could live in Providence, I could actually enjoy this place. And if we can get this city kind of going enough, then I can walk places and I don't have to drive everywhere. Maybe I'll get rid of my car. Well, that's just an enormous victory for I'm sitting here breathing carbon dioxide, right? So I could kill myself and try and solve the planet, but you can't do anything perfectly. You have to give it up sometimes to do something. So I'm not trying to be overly aggressive in my answer or my response, but I just, I admire the work what that has done, because it started as this sort of fire and ice celebration, this sort of elemental, was totally not meant to be a tourist thing. But actually out of this, this unintended consequence is bringing back the city and creating this, really noble human pursuit, which is city life.
If you remember, when we started, many of the buildings downtown were entirely vacant on all of their upper floors. But with the answer there, it surprised me that number A was the majority of people came here by themselves in a car. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't realize that. Trying to look at the panel. Excuse me. But the answer that all of us, the majority of people came as a single person in a car to this event gets exactly to the devilish nature of this problem of how do you engage and solve that. The second largest carbon footprint we have is all the restaurants cooking those meals. So.
I have a question from the audience. Introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hi, my name's Lauren Monis. I'm 21 years old. I'm an organizer with Sunrise, Rhode Island. I'm feeling a little bit confused here as the panel is about a search for solutions, and a solution, which is a Green New Deal, has not been discussed. It is the only solution at the scale and scope of the problem that is on the table right now, and we need to be addressing climate change and environmental racism and our broken economy right now through a Green New Deal at the federal level, and we need to make sure that Rhode Island is prepared to implement a Green New Deal as soon as possible. So we need to revitalize and mobilize at a World War II scale mobilization every sector of our economy. We need to make sure that working class people, people of color, young people who are left out of our economy are put at the center of creating this policy and implementing this policy. And we need to make sure that every person who wants a job deserves to have a job and is included in creating a Green New Deal that transitions our economy and society off of fossil fuels immediately. We need to not build any more fossil fuel infrastructure. We need to make sure that everyone who is transitioning off of fossil fuels undergoes just transition, so has job training and make sure that they can have a job in any new clean energy industry. And I think that we are here at this panel talking about a search for solutions, and there's a solution on the table right now. We need to all be mobilizing together. There's a critical election coming up, and there's no youth on this panel. There's very little youth in this room. There's very little people of color and people who are being most impacted by climate change in this room. So I just want to put it out there that there's a solution on the table. It's the Green New Deal, and we all need to be talking about it and working hard to engage our communities, engage our voters. Young people are the largest voting bloc in this country, and we know that our politicians who are bought out by fossil fuel executives are going to refuse to take the action on climate and jobs and justice that we need. And so we can't keep talking about the search for solutions while we're not talking about who's responsible for this devastating climate change, and that's fossil fuel executives who are buying out our politicians, who then put people on committees.
Do you have a question?
My question is, why are we not talking about the Green New Deal and how to move to fixing our broken economy, centering people of color, young people, working class people at the center of these solutions, and moving right now to address climate change and injustice at the scale and scope of the crisis?
Thank you. So, Nicole Hernandez-Hammer, I'm going to pick on you because you're well-traveled, and you've been talking about this across the country, and I'm wondering if you have an answer for, what's going on with the Green New Deal, and what can we be doing in Rhode Island?
Well, first I want to thank Lauren for her comments and for the work of Sunrise in general, and then Sunrise in Rhode Island. I think you're right on point with that. I think the Green New Deal is probably our best bet to make that 11-year deadline that we have, that the IPCC and the National Climate Assessment has outlined for us. I think a lot of folks criticize it because it is not a complete package with a complete soup to nuts set of solutions. I don't think that's what it's intended to be. I think the original New Deal was not presented that way either. It's a guideline for legislation and policy, and it sets the goals and the standards that we should be striving for. And I think that we can bring that to the state and move in that direction. I also really like the point that Lauren made about the demographics of the room compared to the reality of what the future looks like. Rhode Island is about 25% people of color, but this audience is nowhere near that number. So I think if we want to start moving towards equity and towards what the future looks like, we need to change the processes within the state government, within municipal governments, and also within the green organizations that, in my opinion, are shockingly more white-led than in other parts of the country. I've done a lot of work in the South, and I was really excited to come to New England because I thought, okay, I'm gonna go to a blue state. And people are woke. People are woke there. And I got quite a shock. It was a lot less diverse in academia, which is where I came from. I've met with folks at universities here, and they're pretty much all white. In government, as I mentioned, and in green organizations. And it's really, really disappointing. And I think it's going to get in the way of getting to the goals of equity and true climate resilience. And I'd love to hear what Monica would have to say in addition to that.
No, I ditto what everything that you said. I mean, it's saddening and maddening, and it's like, and even now, like, I'm here, but it was like, I kind of pushed for it, and I was like, hey, can I go to this event? Because, hello, I'm right here. I've been working on this thing for 2 years, and where are the other community members, Where are the people who know about this, who know about this because of their lived experiences, And I think, you know, it's not perfect. The Green New Deal is not perfect, but I think it is probably the best thing that we have at this point. But again, I want to thank the folks from the Green New Deal, Rhode Island. But again, at the same time, a lot of people of color are not being involved in those meetings either. You know what I'm saying? And so it has to be, you know, it has to be inclusive and transparent, and you know, the truth has to be said. We're not included in that either, and we're not included in these big green, in the Sierra Clubs and the Urban Society and things like that. We're not. People want to put a blindfold and say, well, you know, it's our earth, you know, we all live in it, and we all live in it, but at the same time, it's like, again, we're going to be affected the most, and we are the ones who people of color in particular are going to be affected the most and the longest, you know. And so, yeah, even the comment from, you know, Riverside, yeah, I live on the other side of that Riverside, and it's not so beautiful. And when you look at the maps, you can see the majority of people of color live there. And then when you see the other side, you know, where the tanks are not there, you can see who lives there. You know what I'm saying? And so that inequity and that imbalance is, you know, it's all around.
Yeah, thanks, Monica. Alex, in terms of your years of reporting...
Excuse me, they're not doing anything. They're just standing there.
Alex, in terms of your reporting over the past 10 years with regard to the issues being raised right now...
They're not bothering anybody, excuse me. They're not bothering anyone. Excuse me.
It's a challenge because Rhode Island College has a rule about signs in here to not block other people's views. It's happened during the political debates and so forth. So
they're not blocking
that's
nobody's
the concern. Maybe if you could not block the people behind you, I think that would be appreciated by the audience. Alex, in terms of your 10 years of reporting, you know, what are your thoughts around this? I mean, Nicole is talking about we're not seeing, you know, even when I moved to New England, I experienced this is quite a segregated community. All of New England, from my experiences living down south, were very different. And what's your experience in that in terms of environmental justice and climate change and what we're talking about?
I mean, I think that Nicole's right. When we go to climate change events and things like this, we don't see the most diverse audience. Where I did see the most diversity was probably the events where Monica was probably most active. When the Coastal Resources Management Council was assessing, in a way, I guess, an LNG plant that eventually won approval in South Providence. And in that case, you know, definitely more people from South Providence came out, and you saw a more diverse crowd. I mean, I think perhaps, yeah, we just don't see this when we, you know, again, you know, I would argue that probably the earliest impacts that we're seeing in Rhode Island are on the coast, and that may explain why.
Yeah, fair enough. We have another question from the audience. Ma'am?
I would like to add real quick that even though maybe sea level rise is a coastal issue, I've talked to folks that are not wealthy that live in Newport in the 5th Ward, I believe it's called, and they have issues related to flooding, where sometimes they have flooding that makes it hard to get out of their homes during storm events. And then I've talked to people in Pawtucket and Central Falls that are dealing with extreme heat. It's affecting kids you know, in terms of the days that they can go to school and what they're allowed to wear to school. And it's affecting folks that don't have air conditioning and can't afford cooling in their homes. So I think there is a lot that's happening in terms of impacts of climate change in Rhode Island, as Monica had discussed in more detail. And I think that it's really important for there to be a more concentrated effort to amplify those stories and those experiences, and that those experiences be reflected in policies and legislation at the municipal and state levels.
No, I'll also add that some of the areas, you know, I can think in Warren especially, that are already seeing flooding are not affluent areas either. So.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Sheila Craig. I just got back from Atlanta and Al Gore's climate reality training, his leadership training, and the Green New Deal was definitely the way to go as far as the whole feel from the training goes. And only one of our state reps is for the Green New Deal. That was as of 2 weeks ago. I sent an email to both Jack Reed and Sheldon Whitehouse, and I got a really lengthy email back right away from Sheldon Whitehouse. And the gist of it was that he has his own bill. And I emailed him back and I said, Mr. Whitehouse, respectfully, I think it's time to get on board with the Green New Deal. So I think that they could use pressure from everyone to get on board. And I don't know if people realize that only one of our reps is for the Green New Deal. Now that was about 2 weeks ago that I checked, and I don't know if they've changed since then. But also, talking to my friend sitting next to me, she was saying that public occurrences are usually older white people. So it might have something to do with the name, might have something to do with how the information gets out there. But I was also just thinking that maybe RIPTA should be a partner in this as well.
Great idea.
He's looking around.
Peter, you don't have a question?
Oh, it's going to be challenging to get to you, young man.
Raise your hand. He's going around.
Come on in. You can do it better than I can, I think. Okay. Former panelist, by the way, at Publick Occurrences. He already has a reputation, this young man. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name's Colin Galliano. I'm 17 years old, and I'm a senior at North Kingstown High School. And my question is for anyone on the panel, and it is kind of going to introduce it a little bit first. But I believe that the solution revolves around unity. That is the unity in the idea that climate change is an issue that can be solved. The current political climate in the U.S. is one of extreme polarization, and nothing will continue to get done unless climate reform becomes a bipartisan goal. So how do you go about uniting the United States government?
Who wants to take that one?
Well,
Mark's jumping in. Look at this guy.
How do you go
So,
about what?
It's
What
a
you
suicide
saying?
mission.
how do you unite the government, the U.S. government? So I don't have an answer to that question, but I would like to say something that's related because Mike had said to all of us, please come prepared to talk about some solutions. And so the thing that I was going to say is, I think that I have lots of thoughts on various solutions, but I think really the biggest one is voting, choosing to vote for people at all levels, from local officials all the way up to the president, who are on record saying what they want to do to address climate change. And not just, we have let a lot of our politicians slide on this for a long time, and we just can't anymore. We can't let them slide anymore. We must demand that all politicians have some kind of platform on this issue. They need to have thought about it. And until we demand that of them, they're not going to, because that's how politicians roll. Mm-hmm. They don't want to have to say something and be held to it. So this is a really important detail that I personally think is one of the most important things we can do to drive action on this.
And also, I would just add, make sure to see who they appoint to certain things. Make sure that, not only that they're, what they're saying in the campaign trail, but making sure that they're actually appointing people to say, whatever, say the CRMC, that these are actually environmentalists, that they're actually people who care about the coastal resource management, that they have a background in this, that, they're not getting it because they got brownie points. You know what I'm saying?
Mark, you had comment? Yeah.
Well, I listened to this very briefly on my 2-minute commute in my nice car. I was listening to NPR, and there was like a representative or a senator from Tennessee, a Republican, being interviewed by one of the more liberal sort of interviewers on NPR. And he really had, the interviewer really had the guy in the corner about why won't you just sign on with the Green New Deal. This is one of the few Republicans who is like ready for a climate bill, like a serious climate bill, but he won't sign on to the Green New Deal because it's a Democrats' bill. And similarly, so there's this sort of pride of authorship, this strident, thing about it's mine. I want the credit. I'm not using yours, even though yours is 90% the same. And so there's just this impossible attachment to partly what you were saying is attachment to form around whose bill is it that just we can't put up with anymore. I mean, it's Republican, Democrat, Green New Deal, Blue New Deal, whatever. It's like the issues are pretty clear, and we just need to get on with it and not allow all the sloganeering, pardon my French, and just get over it and get it done.
And to Nicole's point earlier, if you believe in what Nicole says, 10 years, that's not too many elections, folks. It really isn't. So I don't know if that political thing is the reality of the change. Yes, sir. Oh, hold it. You asked the question.
I know you control these things firmly. I'm Peter Nightingale, and I'm with Nature's Trust Rhode Island. And well, I'm a scientist, so I can't communicate, but I'll try to do it anyway.
You were doing a fine job without the mic, sir.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so let me look at the audience. I would like to get back to a question that Mark asked, namely, what does a couple of degrees warming mean? Well, let me tell you what it means. It means that over my lifetime, the number of serious extreme weather events has been multiplied by a factor of 25, roughly. Could be 40, 50, something on that order of magnitude. That's important. It's particularly important, and I'm looking at Monica, and I know where she lives, and I would like to also add that her kids, two of her kids, are part of a climate suit that we're holding against DEM, and I have a question for Janet Quoits on that too. I have a whole slew of questions. But let me ask Mr. Fugate something. If the number of serious events has gone up by a factor of 25, and if FERC says we're going to ask that you judge the LNG facility in Providence by a 500-year event, make sure that it can withstand a 500-year event, the 500-year event has become a 20-year event, right? I can divide 25 into 500, I think. Did I do that right? Something like that. So I wonder how on earth CRMC, knowing what it knows, could go ahead and approve this project and not stop it, and it had a possibility of doing that.
I got one question per. I got to come back. I got a whole list. Sorry. Yeah. I'm going up here. Go ahead, Grover.
Okay. There's several factors that come into play. So the ability to review that project, because FERC, under the Natural Gas Act, has what's called preemption, meaning that they limit the state's review to certain areas. Under the coastal program, we were able to still review that under our coastal policies. Our coastal policies, we did apply what we were able to do, limited by FERC and by NOAA, to that project. The project itself, what we did look at was our mapping, and with a sea level rise rate during the expected life of that facility, which we limited to 30 years. National Grid wanted to go a much longer life than that, but we limited that facility to 30 years. And we applied a sea level rise rate and a 100-year event on top of that. It roughly equates out to about a 500-year event by the time we got through, but that's what we did apply to that. And unfortunately, we were limited. We didn't have the full breadth of our program to apply against that. And that's the way it happens sometimes, but it's the way the laws work.
Does Mother Nature know that?
Mother Nature does not know that, and I can assure you she'll teach us many lessons before it's over with.
She'll teach the people of South Providence many lessons. The people who live there and who are going to be impacted the most.
I have another question up here. Yes, sir. State your name and ask your question.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. I'm Pete Galvin, and I'm here representing Nature's Trust Rhode Island. I'll be brief with you. I cannot discuss the lawsuit we have filed against Janet because that would be inappropriate as an attorney. I can merely tell you that there is and has been since September of last year, there has been a concrete, specific proposal with Janet about what she could do on her own. We don't need the legislature where the speaker blocks everything. We don't need, but we do need the governor's support. And so far, nothing. The major problem right now in this state is the governor, Gina Raimondo. He's been pushing fossil fuels, continues to push fossil fuels.
Do you have a question, sir?
The question is, when are we going to see that change? When is she going to step up? We're not talking about some interstate agreement, but just for Rhode Island. When is she going to step up?
I'll respond, and I also won't discuss the lawsuit, so thank you for acknowledging that. I will say that the lawsuit is pushing in the direction that we need to be going. In terms of the governor, I do just want to point out that she's promoting clean energy and has a goal, 1,000 megawatts by 2020, and is aggressively working to promote renewable energy. Offshore wind, which has another set of issues, and the fishing community has a lot of concerns about solar, energy efficiency, where we're the third in the nation. And I know that the regional agreements that you're discussing don't seem like a panacea, but the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative is why we've been able to put tens of millions of dollars into energy efficiency, and the energy we don't use is the cleanest energy of all. So I think working in some of these regional agreements where we can put a tax on carbon, put it back into decarbonizing our electricity and our transportation is something we should be doing. And I think we've got no disagreement that we need to be doing many, many things at once. And I think, I just want to say in response to some comments that a couple different times in dialogue with Monica or folks, I mean, I think one of the things that's tough, and just keeping it real, is that our environmental laws and our state agencies have very specific prescriptive laws, and sometimes we're not looking beyond those because that's our charge, and it is lawsuits and community engagement and dialogue and discomfort that pushes us to look more broadly, and I welcome that.
Yes. Who are you and what's your question?
Richard Staples. I'm a third-generation Rhode Islander, and I'm very proud of our state, also very concerned about climate change and the impact it has on me and my family. I'd like to talk a little bit about the communication side of things for a moment, because as was pointed out earlier, there are not only the folks who are in the auditorium tonight, but we have, in many cases, families, including children, and in my case, grandchildren who live here as well. And I feel like the communication is trying to happen at the current generational level and trying to have an impact on us. And I wondered what some of the panelists might think about trying to communicate more around impacts on children and grandchildren who are young. So it's a little harder, I think, maybe for some to say it's 20 years from now when I'll be 90, but 20 years for my one-year-old grandson is when he'll be in college. And there is extreme events coming down the pike in the not-too-distant future, and I just wondered if that angle of things has been thought out, and maybe ways that that's being communicated now. Thank you.
So I'll take the first stab at this. So yes, certainly there are groups and particular communication strategies that are really emphasizing the effects on people's kids and their grandkids, because we all care about kids and grandkids. So this is actually a good example of thinking about a particular audience and talking with them about, having a conversation with them, not talking to them, but talking about things that matter to that audience. So if you're having a conversation with a group of people who are really are young parents, for example, then yeah, talking about their kids and also about money. So, I think it was Alex maybe in his opening remarks that said something about how we're looking at, oh boy, now I can't even remember what this was. There was something about $200,000. I wrote this down somewhere and now I can't find it in my notes. But anyway, money, my point is, money is, oh no, it was President Sanchez said something about how Rick is saving $200,000 a year because of using LED lights, right? So a lot of people respond to messages about money, whether you're saving money or making money or whatever. Other people respond about messages about their kids. I think something that's really interesting and wonderful that is happening now is the action and organization that we are seeing from young people on climate change. So the fact that this group here from the Sunrise Movement is here tonight and standing up and very bravely saying, hey, it's really my world and you are messing it up and I will not stand for that. I think that takes incredible courage, especially, you know, when you're young. It takes even more courage, and seeing kids all over the world striking on Fridays for climate. You know, this is powerful stuff, and I think it. I don't know. I'm guessing, but I think it could change some minds among older people. You know. So anyway, that's a long answer just to say that. Yes, it is very important to think about how different people and different communities and populations are affected and addressing all of those effects.
Barnaby, do the arts play a role in this?
Absolutely, the arts can play a role in this. And the larger, I mean, the arts very often are voices of many communities, and all these communities need to be engaged. And I think there's actually pretty general agreement across the country about the potential of the Green New Deal. The problem is when you get to specifically defining it, there's a range of things that are included in that, but I think in general, most people feel that's the solution where we should be going. And so I can understand where, you know, supporting different positions, we still need to work out what that is, but I think there's pretty broad support for that, as well as eliminating the fossil fuel industry. There's transitions and lifetimes. You were talking about the natural lifetimes of some of these installations, because we need to also have the clean energy in place in order to do those transitions. But I do feel there's pretty general engagement. I would love to see more young people involved with voting, because our current president in part got there because of a lack of young people coming to the polls. That's, you know, someone mentioned that the current president's positions have really caused us to go backwards in so many respects. And this is probably the most, I think, Sunshine, you were talking about, this is, the complete involvement in these issues is really important, including arts perspectives, writers, musicians, rap artists, everyone needs to be taking this up and putting it as a central part of the future that we all need to invest in.
Monica, when you're engaging folks, do you find that it is an answer or a solution to engage folks is to get people to recognize that this is going to affect their kids? So it's not just, you know, adults talking about the future, but it's talking about the future of your own children or grandchildren?
Well, of course, I mean, I use my kids as examples all the time, and not just from when they're 21, but from now, because it's the fact of the matter is that they are experiencing, and you know, specifically in South Providence, we have the highest asthma rate, you know, and so they're feeling it because, you know, they are literally slowly getting, you know, these toxic chemicals put in their body, whether it's by the water that we have high lead in Providence drinking water, and so I definitely use that. My kids, last year, one of my children was hospitalized 7 times due to her asthma. Again, because it's getting really, really hot, and you know, she went to play outside for a couple of minutes, and she just went into, you know, an asthma attack. So they're definitely feeling it. We're definitely feeling it every day, and I definitely think that we have to focus not only on the children, but focus on the children who are the most marginalized. You know, that being Black, Indigenous, and children of color. So yeah, I definitely appeal to that. And I will also say, like, you know, a lot of us in the community, we know these things are affecting our kids, and it's just heartbreaking that we know these things, and then we're like, well, the kids, and I have to have a balance, because I don't want to put another burden on people in my community to say, you know, our schools are crap, or, you know, we have tons of police all over, and by the way, you know, our air is polluted and our water is not good. So it's definitely something like a balance that I have to keep. But yeah, me having 4 kids. By the way, I've been texting a lot, but my son just went to the mall today for the first time by himself. So he's like texting me, what should I do? And I'm like, you're fine. So yeah, you know, it's just part of what I do because, you know, I have 4 children and I work full time and, but yeah, you know, it's a balance.
Thanks, Monica. Alex, what about this drinking water? Are we in good shape in Rhode Island in your findings, or do we have challenges around drinking water in Rhode Island?
I think overall probably okay right now. You know, the focus of the story that I wrote recently was on Newport because it has coastal reservoirs. They say they have redundancies in their system, so if their coastal reservoirs flood, they have other water sources. I was talking earlier to Grover about those same reservoirs. You know, if salt water intrudes from the underside, then you're not looking at, you know, if a storm surge comes over, it's temporarily taking those reservoirs out of service. If salt water's intruding from the bottom, then it takes them out permanently. And I think you're seeing, or, you know, seeing the start of that perhaps in coastal wells in South County. Again, as sea levels rise, you see salt water mixing with the groundwater. So I think that's a concern, and there aren't, especially in South County, there aren't great alternatives, you know, if you don't have your wells. You know, we have a lot of water in the Scituate Reservoir, but trying to get it to other parts of the state is really expensive. So I think that's sort of the concern in the long run.
Thanks.
You know, and drought is an issue, obviously, too. So.
Yeah. Thank you, Alex. I have another question from the audience. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, my name is Cindy Elder, and in hearing all the impassioned voices, I get the sense that most of the people in this room, in one way or another, really believe that climate change is an issue. What I'm wondering is, how do we find commonality with people who don't yet feel that and who are still good people, but for one reason or another, they haven't climbed on board? My sense is that we spend a lot of time telling people things, really caring about it and providing a lot of information, but how do we listen and how do we engage in a way that pulls people in who aren't there yet?
Nicole, is this a question you're prepared to answer?
Yeah. So, look in the mic. Oh, the mic. I'm so bad about this. Well, I think as we start seeing more climate change impacts, so hotter summers, wetter wet seasons, drier dry seasons, more intense storms, the conversations go naturally to the discussion around the impacts of climate change. I think for a long time the discussion was about how do we kind of get people on board for something that's not happening now, but it's happening now. And I think as people start to make the connection between what they're experiencing in the summertime, for example, the more likely they're going to be able to engage in the discussion of climate change. I've done a lot of work with Republicans on the Hill, and both as a scientist, but as an activist as well. And as a scientist, I would go with graphs and charts and figures that I thought were incredibly compelling. But I didn't see the kind of action that I would have liked to have seen. And then as an activist, I went back with mothers from communities of color to talk about the impacts they were dealing with. And that actually made a much bigger impact. So I think the realities of climate change that are occurring now are kind of the strongest message that we can send and that we can share with folks that are still, you know, like you said, good people, but aren't on board with the discussion as they should be. And Sunshine, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, it's about conversations. It's that simple. It's about, you know, asking people questions. Like, so what is it? What is it about this that you're not comfortable with, or, you know, that you don't agree with, or whatever? And honestly listening, and have, you know, like, not, we tend, we just like, as a species, right, we don't like conflict with people. We kind of tend to go away from that. And I'm not suggesting that you get in a big argument. In fact, quite the opposite. I'm suggesting that we need to do a lot more just honest listening and dialoguing with one another to get to a point where we can move past the walls that we have constructed in many cases with regard to climate change. So yeah, it's people like people, you know? So if you can tell a story about how real people are, like how, you know, a young girl is suffering 7 asthma attacks in a year, that's a pretty compelling story, even to a politician.
You would think.
Yeah, right. It should be. It should be a pretty compelling story.
I think there's a third factor that I think have to be acknowledged, is that there's also, you have fossil fuel industry money deliberately going into falsification of a story and deliberate creation of ambiguity and uncertainty. And that makes this conversation a very one-sided, unfair competition, because it's quite often hidden and masked and comes in different stories. There actually was pretty good unanimity on both parties about the need for climate change when the first President Bush was in the White House. But in the meantime, a tremendous amount of money has been spent trying to preserve the business model of particularly very large industries, and it's quiet money. It's not necessarily political contributions. It's paying for think tanks. It's paying for very dubious studies that really aren't properly vetted, and it's the deliberate creation of ambiguity about the data specifically to prevent a constructive conversation happening. And that's a particularly egregious example of not fairly participating in what a democracy is supposed to be about. And it's very hard to fight, though.
Could I just add, I think that's insidious and it's true. And I think that one of the things I see is that people who disagree no longer can listen and engage, and it gets amplified through social media and through personal attacks. And so I think if we can, and I want to come out of this session doing a better, we can't solve necessarily the big money going into politics at the national level right now, but we can do a better job of engaging and communicating here in Rhode Island and listening and looking for solutions together. And I think that this panel and some of the comments today is a good reminder that how valuable that is and that we need to do a better job. So I would like to do that.
I get in a lot of conversations with applicants coming before us, and it's interesting because I'm not sure if we get it sometimes. Even when it's thrust in our face, I'm not sure that we get it. So if you were to go to Miami, if ever there was a city that should be concerned about this, and particularly the longevity within that community, how it's going to survive into the future, because I could just go through a bunch of facts about that place, and it's got a very short time frame. But there's a building boom that's going on there in that city that's unprecedented. So how do we not connect the 2 points together? It's mind-boggling to me. There was a presentation I saw. It was done, I think, by one of the authors of the Rolling Stone. It was a little film, and it was looking into the outskirts of Miami. There was a very poor neighborhood there. It was one of these sunny day events where the trucks were driving by up to their rocker panels in salt water. No rain, no nothing, just a high tide event that had come into this community. And they were trying to converse with the locals there about essentially the toxic cesspool they were living in, because it was all septic systems that were within that area. And as the camera panned a little to the left, there was a brand new house being constructed in that area. And we just don't seem to get it sometimes. I don't know what it's going to take for us to get it, but we as a race or human beings or whatever, we just sometimes just can't connect the dots.
All right, this is, I know there were a lot of hands. I tried to keep you in order. I may have lost track. But I have one question, and then we'll close up. But don't leave, because if you've got one of those eye clickers, I got a question for you at the end, so don't go anywhere, all right? Here's our final question.
So My name is Christian Ortiz Blanco, and I'm a student at Rhode Island College and a Young Voices alum. And my question for both Monica and Mark is, so as an individual who was born and raised in a low-income community, Wiggins Village, what steps can residents take to push the developers to invest in eco-friendly and disaster-preventing infrastructure? But also, what can we do to motivate the residents in that area to care, because they have so many other issues and concerning things in their daily lives that at the end of the day, the last thing on their mind is, oh, we should also care about the planet, when they have to take Jimmy to school and they have to go to work and they also have to buy groceries and they have to take care of their kids' laundry. There's a lot going on in those individuals' lives. So what can we do to both motivate low-income community members and also motivate those who have invested in those communities?
I think that, thank you for your question. I think that our community is very motivated and cares deeply about the environment. But what happened is that when you have some of these events at the police, when you hold an event at the police station at 6 o'clock at night, who's going to that? You know what I'm saying? When you, you know, we have to have our needs met in order to come out to these community events and in order to show up. If you know, we need to provide transportation. We need to, sometimes I have meetings that I have to provide dinner. I have to provide childcare. You know, when we go to the meetings to debate and testify, things like that, we have to have money for parking for people to go down there, or bus fare. You know, it's just very complex, and there's, like you said, when we have all these other things going on, you know, it's hard to kind of show up for these events. But I wouldn't say that they wouldn't care about them. I think they care deeply, and I think that Black, brown, and indigenous people have been caring about the environment for 526 years on this side, you know, on this side. You know, since forever, but more so, you know, since colonization, when the indigenous people stood up and said, hey, stop killing the beavers because for hats, or stop killing the whales for like the blubber, you know, you know, for candles, you know. And so that long we've been caring about it and we've been saying about it. It's just because we've been caught up in this structure, not caught up, we've been purposely placed in these structures of oppression and white supremacy and racial segregation. Then we have been pushed we've been pushed to these margins, and it's really difficult to come out and show up. So yeah.
Well, you know, business people, this is an analogy that an accountant once used with me, are a little bit like squirrels, and they're just out chasing nuts and trying to put them away for the winter. So if you give, you know, business people rules that are reasonable, most business people will follow the rules and just try and go gather up the nuts and put them away for a winter day. If the rules keep changing, if the rules, you don't know what the rules are going to be tomorrow, then it becomes very difficult to go out and do things. So one thing you can do for developers is make more rules around sustainable design. And I'm not looking for tons of regulation. But it's just a fact.
Funny, not funny.
So, you know, we would probably find a way to build more sustainable buildings if more sustainable buildings were required. You can't do it in a vacuum without real input from business people, because it's a real world and real bills have to be paid, but that's one thing I would suggest. Even the oil industry, you know, if better rules could be put in place, they would respond and they probably wouldn't disappear altogether immediately. So that's one thing. As far as to get residents to be more aware of these issues, I mean, it's something I struggle with every day. I live in, you know, a mixed income neighborhood, and, you know, in my household, we recycle like immaculately. I mean, we recycle toilet paper tubes, and, you know, we cut the little labels off, you know, avocado peels before we compost them in our yard and that sort of thing, because we like to put them in our garden without all the little labels. But it turns out that, you know, the recycling truck goes down our street, and once it picks up 3 buckets and the camera shows the driver that there have been 3 buckets that have contaminated loads, that truck just goes to the dump. It doesn't go to the, so we're constantly, as neighbors, as an employer, as a landlord, whatever, just constantly after people to stop using plastic bags in recycling. And, you know, it's just a constant battle to talk to people. I don't know what to say about it. It's just, it is what it is.
Mike, just,
yeah, go ahead, Janet.
Quickly, again, I'm going to give a shout out to RIDO, our Department of Health, because the health equity zones that they are doing in 9 communities, I think have been a way of engaging people in an empowering way on what are the public health issues that they do care about, regardless of how busy their lives are. And I think that it is a good model. It's something that the Resilient Roadie Plan is promoting to expand, because it seems to me we need more examples of good models for community engagement that we can replicate. And so I think that's one way that issues that are of importance to the community, including climate resilience, have been brought forth in a way that's brought in government, not to lead, but to follow.
Thank you. Let's go to that final eye clicker question. Pull them out. Pull out your eye clickers. And you answered this one before. We'll see if there's any change after hearing from folks. How optimistic are you that we can adequately address the impacts of climate change? A, highly optimistic. B, somewhat optimistic. C, somewhat pessimistic. And D, highly pessimistic. Keep on voting. You didn't lose your eye clicker, did you? Oh, you're being much more selective this time. You're not going to offend me, don't worry. Anybody else? Going once? Going twice? All righty. Somewhat optimistic. Paul Park will tell you if there is much change, I think, in tomorrow's paper. Alex, what's on the horizon in reporting and the environment, and where are you headed? What else we got coming from you?
So I think in this series, I'll be looking at sewage treatment plants, which are naturally vulnerable because they're all low-lying and on the coast or on rivers. The Port of Providence, obviously Monica brought that up, but I think it's a big issue. And coastal erosion in general, too. So, yeah, that's what I'm looking at.
Awesome.
Yep.
All of our panelists tonight are going to receive Rhode Island College Pure Honey. They do honey here. Can you imagine?
It's
so that's pretty
wonderful.
cool.
It's wonderful.
Please, a round of applause for all our panelists. Thank you very much for coming, for caring, and for being good Rhode Islanders. And we'll see you at the next Publick Occurrences this fall.